get started with David and Anne's really fantastic presentation. Well, thanks everybody for joining in. My name is Rod Latham. I'm one of the founders with these fantastic folks of Compost Academy. We're really excited to talk about Compost Academy because we wanted to show people how to actually generate the soil that can improve their health, improve their biology, can perfect and can actually restore landscapes. Seeing the work of Keish and Casey and Brian firsthand is really amazing because you see their compost creates a green thumb. I've seen these landscapes regenerate from what next door is like a total desert, a total mustard moonscape, into what looks like it's 20 years ahead of time recovery. And it really goes to show that this compost is not just compost. It is life, it's biology. And so the lessons that we learn about compost are how we move forward into the future to restore our own health and health of our soil. And so the way that David and Anne's books infected me, dirt is one of the most important and mind-blowing ecological history books I've ever read, tying the story of that should be taught in every school. It's as important of all of our human history because it's the history of our ecosystems, how from the Dust Bowl to the Roman Empire to the Levant, how civilizations who did not heed the call of caring for the soil inevitably declined and collapsed. And so that lesson is so important right now because it's happening again for us and we need to listen to it. And the hidden half of nature so ties everything together. We think that soil health and human health is different, but it is all the same. I come from having gut issues, which led me to trying to eat organically and learning, how do I learn about permaculture and soil and hidden half of nature really wrapped together and blew my mind that these things are the same. You restore soil health. It's a lot of the same protocols for gut health too. So it's this beautiful tying together of all these principles. So that's me. I wanted to move it to whether it's Keish or Casey or Brian, how you guys have been impacted by their books and what you're excited about with Compost Academy.
I'll go last. So Keisha Casey.
I'll go
Okay.
next. I'll go next. Yeah, so this is like the Hidden Half of Nature, one of my favorite books. I found it after I started my career. I'm Keisha Ernst, by the way. Sorry. Farmer, composter, teacher at Compost Academy, lover of soil and all things microbe. I'd already started my career as a consultant. I was working on transitioning lands when I found the book. And it was interesting because I have this memory of reading the book and thinking like I had a friend with me, like there was support that I got from this book, like as if there was someone sitting right next to me that helped me get through a specific job that I was doing. And I didn't remember exactly what it was until we were preparing for this webinar. And Casey and I sat down, we were listening to it again. And it was when David was talking about Anne going around and piling organic materials everywhere. It was like the very beginning of the book, and he's just like, she's crazy bringing in yards and yards and yards of organic material and heaping them all over the place. And I remembered like that was actually the part of the book that it got me through the work I was doing. We were on this land regeneration project that was 18 acres. It was huge. We had no idea how we were actually going to make it work. And that property was letting go of probably 10 yards of waste through a green bin, every month. And I heard that book and I thought, oh my gosh, like I'll just be like Anne, I'll take this organic material and I'll just pile it everywhere. I'll add the microbes from my compost and that should work, right? Cross my fingers. And it did. It was actually the most amazing land transformation by just using organic materials and tailored, microbe extracts to transition the soil. And so it's just really, I love the simplicity of the book. I love the depth of the book. Really, it's inspired me. And I'm just so grateful to have you guys here today. Thank you so much for showing up and sharing with us.
Nice. Hi, everybody. I'm Casey Ernst. Yeah, as well, team member with these guys at Compost Academy, and then we also at Catalyst Bioamendments, our compost company. But yeah, I guess for me in this book, it is funny, like even kind of based on what Keisha just said and David talking about Anne. I'm just like he's describing Keisha at the same time. I don't know if you can see over her shoulder right now with the house plants. He's talking about how she twists each house plant to make it bend in the right direction, and just like Keisha's the exact same way. It's hilarious. But yeah, I really I think, and this is the hidden half of nature. The idea behind there's a line in there like near the beginning of the book where you talk about like old scientific journals and how like anybody could pick that book up and have an idea about what is going on, right? And the modern books we read is like the enzyme DH1 was in correlation to the X-teen factor of the FDI, whatever, it's like absolute jargon, it's absolute nonsense. And I think with these books, it's like you bridge that gap, right? You get rid of that, like that exclusionary language. And not that it's not scientific, but it's understandable, it's relatable, and anybody can pick it up and people can understand it. I think that's like one of the big things we do at the Compost Academy as well, is like don't get rid of the science, get rid of the exclusionary language, get rid of that inability to just how anyone can come up to it, see it, understand it, and participate. And I think that's one of like the best things about that writing style and the things in your guys' books. So
Fantastic. All right. So I am Brian Vag. Also, I am one of the co-founders of the Compost Academy, and also I'm a soil biology consultant. So I help do a lot of restoration of both agriculture and horticulture growing systems. And it really, Hidden Half of Nature was one of those books for me that was in kind of, I think, four books that really kind of set the stage and the direction for this kind of career path that I'm on now. And that was, same with Toby Hemingway's Guy's Garden, Jeff Lowenfeld's Team with Microbes, Bill Molson, David Holmgren's Permaculture Design Manual, and The Hidden Half of Nature by you guys. Really, those four books for me solidified a lot of my understanding and really kind of put me on the path. And really also of recent, your writings have been very, personally impacted for me. So my wife and I moved away from our homestead, where I think we estimated that we probably grew, raised, or traded for about 80% of the food we ate off of our homestead. And we were eating really good, nutritious food. In fact, that Hidden Half of Nature was really kind of that impetus of let's grow really nutrient dense food and let's eat really, really well. Well, when we moved away from our homestead, we went up to the Oregon coast from rural to city life. And we didn't have any food systems set up at all. And so we've had to buy grocery store food, rely upon farmers markets and those kind of things. And after 6 months from when we moved, my wife started having some very severe symptoms, health issues. And it took us about another year and a half to figure out that she has an autoimmune disorder. And what's really kind of wild about this is that she's had these symptoms bubbling in the background for probably 2 decades. But I think because we lived on our homestead and the way we ate, it just suppressed all of that. And then when we moved up here and didn't have access to that good nutrient dense food, and really were not very inspired by the food that we were buying, that's when her health really changed. And for the last year and a half, we've been very focused in on changing our diet to be much more around whole foods and around nutrient density, and using food as a main source of medicine to try to resolve her autoimmune issues. And it works. And it's amazing. Once we're on that path and then we go travel, we don't have access to that food, within a week, those symptoms will start to really kind of, come back. And it just really solidified for us. And your last book, What Your Food Ate, really kind of hit home. And that's helped us in our paradigm of trying to understand what kind of foods do we want to eat and how do we really try to source and grow food. And we're putting our own urban homestead up here into place, and so our food systems are coming online. But boy, it can't come soon enough. That's for sure. So I, like everybody else mentioned, I'm super excited. You guys have definitely been a huge influencer into a lot of the work that we've done. And I am excited to turn this over to you guys and have you guys share your work with us. So David and Anne, take it away.
All right. Well, hey, thank you all for that. Authors love to hear such things about their books. So thank you all very much. It's been quite an interesting journey and ride. And what we're going to try and do today is give you an overview of the four books that we've written, a little preview of the fifth book that's coming out this coming summer. And I'm going to start, and just for the record, I'm Dave. Anne's next to me. We're going to start off with, I'll be doing the first half of the talk, and then I'll hand off to Anne for the second part. I'm a geologist by training, so I've come to understand and study soils from a rather different perspective than many of you, I would imagine. Anne is a biologist and a person with an admitted case of plant lust. So she is coming more from the biological and botanical end of things. And when you put together geology and biology, I mean, in nature, that makes soil. So, probably we were destined to think about or write about these things, but we're going to give you that preview through those books. I'll try and share my screen here now, and get rolling with that, and we'll see how this works. Yeah, I think we're in business. Okay, so Anne will be back in a little bit once I get through my part. But these are the covers of the 4 books: Dirt, The Hidden Half of Nature, Growing a Revolution, and What Your Food Ate, that were mentioned. Our website is down here in the lower corner. We're not very active on Twitter anymore since it got so weird, but if you want to connect with us, you can communicate via our website, and we do get those emails. So anyway, I started writing Dirt because as a geologist, I was interested in starting to get into the story of how soil erosion had impacted societies in the past. And it turned out I eventually wrote a book about the history of farming and about how the way people treated their land affected the way the land would treat their descendants. Coming out of that, Anne and I wrote The Hidden Half of Nature that dove into what's the real root of fertility in soil. And it turns out to be the microbial world, that hidden half of nature, below ground, out of sight, out of mind, all too often. And that Elaine Ingham was such a pioneer at trying to unravel and explain its intricacies to us all. Growing a Revolution is the book that started to look at whether or not regenerative farming could employ the principles that were uncovered in The Hidden Half of Nature to solve the problem we wrote about in Dirt. And then What Your Food Ate was our most recent book that tried to look at the role of how the way that we farm affects what gets into our food. And it's the microbial world, the part that we wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature, that is really mediating and modulating those kind of relationships. So we're going to get into the story and that kind of connection, starting with the problem that we wrote about in Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations. And that problem is that soil degradation is now a global problem. I looked back in the Dirt book at the history of societies around the world that had degraded their land, but today we're kind of out of new places to go. And this map, the UN's Global Map of Soil Degradation, I like to use because it illustrates that soil degradation is a global problem. There's a lot of red zones on the map. You can treat the orange zones kind of with a grain of salt. There's some degradation in those regions, but there's by some estimates about a third of the world's soil has been degraded to the point where it's not usable for agricultural production at this point, and that's a problem when we look going forward, because today we're still losing about 0.3% of our global food production capacity each and every year to soil erosion and soil degradation, at least according to the UN's Global State of the Soil Assessment. And that 0.3% doesn't sound like a big number in any one year, but you play that out over a century and it turns into 30%. And this is at a time when we've already degraded about a third of our world's productive capacity for agriculture, or at least the soil's productive capacity, and our population is continuing to rise. This is an obvious problem looming down the road, for which there's parallels in the history of regions around the world that I wrote about in the Dirt book. And if a nonfiction book can have a villain, the villain of Dirt was the plow. Now, the plow is an iconic agricultural implement, right? And farmers use it to prepare the seed beds for planting, to control weeds. It's used all over in many parts of the world. But what is it about the plow that actually started off cycles of soil degradation in many regions around the world in the past? And it's that it leaves the ground bare and vulnerable to soil erosion by water or by wind. And nature clothes herself in plants. They help to hold the soil on the land. And when the land is bare and the soil can erode faster than the soil forms, we're literally losing soil at a pace that's unsustainable. And when I wrote the Dirt book, I didn't just look at the archaeology and the history of past societies. I also looked into modern studies in terms of how fast contemporary farms are losing soil globally. And I spent about a month literally in a library vacuuming up all the data I could find on soil erosion from around the world, and concluded that in modern agriculture, modern conventional agriculture that typically involves a lot of plowing, erodes off about 1 inch of soil in 20 years. That's a pace of about 1 millimeter a year. It's pretty slow by anybody's standards except a geologist, for which 1 millimeter a year is screamingly fast. And why do I think that's a really fast pace of soil erosion? Well, because it takes nature 500 to 1,000 years to rebuild that inch of soil. that we're eroding off on average globally in just a couple decades. And if you're doing something, 10 to 100 times faster, if you're burning something up 10 to 100 times faster than you're replacing it, you're literally running out of it. And I'm not arguing that we're going to run out of dirt, run out of soil globally, but the point is that we're degrading our agricultural lands faster than they can heal themselves at this point. And it's not just the loss of the soil itself through erosion. It's also the loss of soil organic matter. There was a paper published in the journal Sustainability a few years back that looked at the degradation of North American agricultural soils that concluded that the soil organic matter content of soils across North America is about 50%, about half of the level that they were at when they were first converted from forests or prairies to farmlands. And it turns out, as Anne's going to be discussing in more detail, that organic matter is the fuel that drives the microbial life that turns the great engine of fertility in the land. And we've in effect drained down our batteries on our agricultural lands by about half, the natural batteries, by about half over the last century, leaving us essentially dependent on large amounts of things like synthetic fertilizers that are being disrupted by the disaster that's unfolding in the Middle East at the moment. It's not a recipe for resilient agriculture to depend on things that can be disrupted like that. And so I've been very intrigued with the idea of a smarter way to go about it that can actually reverse the process of soil degradation. So what is it that the loss of soil organic matter looks like? It looks like these two soils. The one on the right, that khaki soil, is a soil from a tobacco farm in North Carolina that's been farmed conventionally for about 100 years. The soil on the left is one from a farm that was abandoned in the 19th century because its soil had become degraded at that point, and it was left to go back to a forested condition, and that forest reintroduced organic matter, and the difference in color between these two soils is pretty much organic matter and the signs of the activities of life in the soil. I have yet to meet a farmer that would rather be farming this khaki crusty California beach sand looking soil than this more of a rich chocolate cake kind of a soil. And the organic matter content is quite different, from less than 1% up to 4% or so on the one on the left. And so the problem of soil degradation is not just the loss of the soil through erosion, but it's the degradation of soil organic matter. And the third part that you can't really see, the hidden half of nature, it's the life in the soil that is the engine that drives transformations. So here we see evidence for recovery over about a century of farming or degradation of the contemporary farm. These soils are formed on the same geology and the same climate. The only difference is how they've been managed, how they've been farmed for the last 100 years. So what is it about modern farming that leads to degradation of the soil? Well, there's really two primary processes: heavy routine tillage and the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Imagine a rainstorm the afternoon after this photograph was taken of a California farm. What color is the water that would run off that field would be? Well, it would be muddy. Basically, it's a recipe for losing that topsoil. Heavy tillage results in accelerated erosion, but it also can result in degradation of soil organic matter by stimulating bacterial life to break down the organic matter, leaving it impoverished if it's not replaced. And the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers also leads to the degradation of soil organic matter, drawing down the native soil organic matter over time. So these two styles of farming that are so central to modern conventional farming have degraded soils faster than ever over the last century. And the Dirt book tells the longer backstory. But when I finished writing that book, I was left with questions about whether we could reverse the historical pattern of soil erosion and degradation on profitable working farms. And if so, how fast could we do it? And I'm happy to basically say that this point represents the end of the depressing part of the talk, because the answers to both these questions are yes, and really fast, surprisingly fast, at least as far as I was concerned when I started this. And this shows you evidence of how that can happen. This is actually what Anne did to the soil in our yard. She'll tell you more about how she did that in her part of the talk. But when we bought a house in North Seattle back in 1997, if I'm recalling right, it had soil that looked a lot like that Virginia tobacco plantation, this khaki stuff on my right hand on the left-hand side of the screen. But over a course of about a decade of intensive composting and mulching and regenerative gardening, Anne turned this really crappy soil into this absolutely beautiful, dark black, really rich chocolate cake kind of soil that was full of life. And the life above ground was actually rebounded as well, as she'll show you. But this started to convince me that it was possible to rebuild soil fertility and do it much faster than nature tends to do it, because Anne rebuilt that soil in a decade. It didn't take centuries. So I went off to visit regenerative farmers around the world who had done to their farms what Anne had done to our yard, as a way to try and investigate, well, what are the practices? What are the processes that could actually reverse land degradation on farms? And I came to a fairly broad conclusion initially here, and some more specific ones I'll get to in a moment. But when we look at the philosophical foundation of conventional agriculture, it really emphasizes agrochemistry, and in the sense that treating soils as a medium in which to simply hold up crops and add the elements that are needed to grow, which goes all the way back to Justus von Liebig in the 19th century. But as much as Liebig promoted the use of chemical fertilizers, what most people miss about his work is that in his last book, the book he wrote at the end of his career as he was approaching retirement, when he was probably about my age, he basically wrote that organic matter and things like composting and mulching, returning organic matter to the land, was the only way to sustainably farm. The agrochemical approach could boost production short term, but would not solve the problem in the long term. And here we are, a century and a half later, learning that lesson all over again. Regenerative agriculture, on the other hand, emphasizes cultivating soil life. It takes Elaine's concept of the soil food web and puts it to work in agriculture in thinking about how to actually build healthy, fertile soils as a consequence of intensive farming. And I convinced myself that that can be done, not by doing it myself. I have a brown thumb. Anne is the green thumb in our family. But I did it by visiting regenerative farmers around the world who had already done to their farms what Anne did to our yard. And I visited farmers in Central Africa, small subsistence farmers, large farms across the American Midwest and up into Canada, farms in Central America, lots of different styles and scales of farming. And what I found is that the common elements among all those farms that had rebuilt healthy, fertile soils through profitable, intensive farming was the combination of practices based on these three out of these four simple principles, and others also used the fourth. But minimizing disturbance, and by that I mean physical and chemical disturbance, minimizing tillage, minimizing plowing, if not going totally no-till, minimizing agrochemical inputs, if not eliminating them and going organic. Keeping the soil always covered, no bare soil to be eroded by wind or rain, so that translates into cover crops. And growing diverse crop rotations, which could either be done like with 8 crops in the one field all at the same time, as many of the African farms I visited were practicing, or whether it's a rotation of at least 4 or 5 crops in a sequence. That's not a common 2-crop rotation is practiced in many parts of the U.S. Some of those regenerative farmers were also reintegrating animal husbandry into their operations, and I came to think of cattle in particular, not so much as agents of soil destruction, which I had actually documented and written about in my PhD thesis in terms of overgrazing in the California coast ranges. But it turns out the overgrazing that was done in the late 19th century was done wrong. There's ways to graze that can rebuild soil fertility, and in that sense, one can look at cattle as self-propelled manure dispensers and microbiome inoculators if we manage them regeneratively. I don't have time to go into the full principles behind that today, but basically, those principles, the first 3 at least, are also synonymous with the principles of conservation agriculture that the UN advertises as a way to build sustainable farming. And those general principles translate to any setting that I've seen around the world and to different scales of farms. But the specific practices used to implement those principles of minimal disturbance, keeping the ground covered, and growing a diversity of crops need to be tailored to the specific farm and specific setting. And that's where sort of getting into the art of what to do and how compost and mulches can actually enter into this regenerative framework really comes to light. What can that do to soils on working farms? This figure shows you changes in the soil on David Brandt's farm in Carroll, Ohio. It was a a farm that was selling crops into the commodity crop markets of wheat, corn, and soybeans for the most part, but that's not all they grew. They grew a diversity of cover crops, and over time, starting with going to no-till and then planting cover crops and diversifying cover crops, they turned this this organic matter poor khaki soil that didn't have a lot of life into it, into this rich, dark chocolate cake kind of soil that actually has more carbon in it than the native soil in the area of Ohio that David was farming. His farm's not the only one that's done this. Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser's farm, Singing Frogs Farm in Sebastopol, California, turned soil like you can find today in the adjacent vineyard, growing on the same geology and the same climate, just different style of farming. The Kaisers started out with soil like this, and over about a decade, they turned it into rich, granular, organic matter-rich soil like that on the right. Again, and that the different color difference there is organic matter, and organic matter is about 50–60% carbon. So this is an illustration of how farming practices can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and park it in the soil to build up organic matter. That fourth principle of reintegrating animal husbandry is one that's very well illustrated by Gabe Brown's farm in Bismarck, North Dakota. This is his market garden field after the harvest, where he brings in cattle to graze off the crop stubble, brings in chickens to graze off the flies that come off of the cow patties. He also then sells chicken, eggs, and beef. Makes for a profitable farm, but it has also led to the restoration of his soil. This is the soil from that particular field we were just looking at, that rich black soil. The soil in his left hand down there is his neighbor's farm for comparison. There's no doubt that Gabe's soil has more organic matter, is more fertile, and he essentially, by adopting these regenerative principles, he weaned himself off of all chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So he's essentially gone organic by going down this regenerative pathway. What did that do to his soil? This is a slide borrowed from Gabe's TED Talk, where he shows this change in practices from when he went first no-till in 1993. He had 3 inches of topsoil and less than 2% organic matter. After adopting diversity of crops and getting better cover crop integration, or in diversity of cash crops, getting cover crops in, and then diversifying his cover crops, and then finally adding livestock, he was able to triple his soil organic matter, going from less than 2% to more than 6%. And his topsoil depth went from 3 inches to more than a foot, 14 inches. That's a lot of carbon put into the ground, and it also built the fertility of Gabe's ranch to the point where he was relying on what Anne and I like to call the soil health diet to nourish his crops, and not the conventional fertilizer diet that most conventional farmers in the westernized world used. We know that you can grow large harvests out of even degraded soil if you use enough N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and you add that, you can get a lot of biomass out of the soil. But those plants don't invest as much in their roots to do so. They get kind of lazy. And as Anne will explain more to you, that results in undercutting partnerships with microbes in the soil that provide micronutrients and beneficial metabolites to plants. Whereas if you grow crops in organic matter-rich soil, the plants will invest heavily into developing a root system because it pays off. And it pays off in terms of not needing as much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, if any synthetic fertilizers, but it also boosts their micronutrient and beneficial metabolite contributions to those crops, providing a health plan for those crops in ways that Anne will talk more about. What I came away from researching Growing a Revolution and realizing is that there's a lot of benefits for having healthy soil on a farm, not the least, or restoring healthy soils on degraded farms, and not the least of which is higher farmer profits. Because if you can harvest comparable yields after converting and restoring your soil, and the farmers around the world I visited all reported yields comparable to their conventional neighbors once they had restored the fertility of their land. There's a transition period, but once that happens, they're using less fertilizer, less pesticide, and less fossil fuel to harvest the same comparable amounts. That's a recipe for a more profitable farm. It also is a recipe for increasing soil carbon, and that carbon is carbon taken out of the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis, the best way anybody's ever invented to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And it also results in better water retention on site and less off-site pollution. The simple best way to reduce off-site nitrogen and phosphorus runoff from farms is to use less of it in the first place. And you don't have to just take my word for it in terms of the profitability of regenerative farms. Claire Lacan and Jonathan Lundgren from South Dakota State University, a few years back, right after Growing a Revolution came out, did a study that compared, I think it was 20 conventional and regenerative farms growing corn across the Corn Belt in the U.S., where you compare the revenue and cost per hectare of the two styles of farming, and that's the top of these bars. So you notice the regenerative farms, had higher yields. They were harvesting more off of it. And if you subtract off those colored amounts, that's what the farmers were spending on corn, on seeds, crop insurance, fertilizers, and so forth. And you notice that the white bar left over, the profit, was almost, 30–40% higher on the regenerative farms than on the conventional farms. This is the kind of data that started making me an optimist and thinking that, hey, maybe the environmental and the economic incentives here are starting to line up in favor of more regenerative practices. But Anne and I were still left with questions about what the role of regenerative farming may mean for what actually gets into the human diet and what that means for our health. So in the interest of setting up her half of the talk and also conveying one of the things that we learned in writing What Your Food Ate, Anne and I conducted a 10-paired farm study across the United States from California all the way over to Connecticut, where we took a regenerative farm that had been using these principles of regenerative agriculture for at least 5 and no more than 10 years, using them all together, and compared that to a paired neighboring conventional farm where they were farmed using sort of conventionally average techniques. And then we had them grow the same crops in the same year in adjacent fields, and we tested the nutrient density of those crops. So in terms of soil health, the regenerative farms, the blue box and whisker thing down here in the lower corner, the regenerative farms had about twice as much soil organic matter on average than the conventional ones. In terms of their soil health scores, with the Haney soil health score test, the regenerative farms had about 3 times the soil health score. What's the difference between just soil organic matter and the soil health score? Life in the soil biology, the soil food web. The regenerative farms had much more active soil biology. This is what one of them looked like as a regenerative vegetable farm. Brian O'Hara's regenerative farm in Lebanon, Connecticut, has some of the most gorgeous organic matter rich, life-filled soil I've ever seen, and it produces a lot of food off of small acreages. But what's in that food? Well, on average, what we found in that study is that phytochemicals, carotenoids, phenolics, and phytosterols, compounds that are known to have beneficial effects on human health, were 15 to 20% higher on average in the regenerative produce. And in terms of micronutrients, certain vitamins were 15 to 30% higher, and mineral elements were all over the map, as you might expect for a study across the diverse geology of the United States. And soil health scores, though, were consistently about 30% to 2.5 times higher on the regenerative farms. In other words, there's evidence that soil health is our health, that the way that we treat the land translates into how the land and its produce will then eventually treat us in our diets. So at this point, I'll basically share that we've got a new book coming out this summer called Regen, that is about regenerative agriculture, that tries to make the case that we're at a time when we need a soil health revolution. We need to reform and reframe farming practices around the world, both conventional and organic, into a regenerative framework that builds soil health as a consequence of intensive farming practices. And at this point, I'm going to step out of the picture and reintroduce Anne into your screen so she can tell you more about the hidden half of nature and the connections to human health.
All right. The show is going on. Here we are. For the rest of the talk, what I really want to talk about is sort of all of the research and findings that came out of the hidden half of nature was just this wealth of insights really about how things work, and in particular, where it has led. And I guess I should say as well, interestingly, this journey that began with dirt was in some ways completely unplanned, but it's all stacking up because everything in the hidden half that we had learned that rolled on over into what your food ate, and we began to see, aha, do we have a cure on hand? And indeed, I think David and I both believe, because of all we've written and everything we've seen, that if we are able to turn agriculture around, focus it on regenerative practices that bring the health back to the soil, this is a cure. That at least is what we're going with. All right, so where did this journey start? Well, this is our old house in rainy old Seattle, back when we first moved to Seattle. And I show this picture sometimes and people think, wow, look at all of the green there. Okay, what this is, my friends, this is really a giant patch of I don't know, decades old grass mixed in with dandelions, not the nice kind you can eat, but the ones covered in stickers that you step on them and you go, yikes. So this definitely was not my idea of a garden at all. And so I began kind of scheming and dreaming and wondering what could this look like? And lo and behold, here we are some years later, and I want to get plants in the ground. And we had cleared off the surface itself. We'd done some, a few other things you can see here. But then I looked at this, and I looked at Dave, and I said, WTF, what are we going to do? This sent me into an utter panic. I had done enough gardening that I saw, like, how is this ever going to grow anything? Least of all, a lush, verdant garden filled with all kinds of plants throughout all of the seasons. And we were really kind of in a pickle because this was in August, and this was even long ago enough that even at that point in time, Seattle's summers were really, really beginning to heat up, and irrigation and water is actually now a big issue in our region that it hadn't been in the past because of all of our precipitation. But be that as it may, water was also on my mind here. And it was pretty much the beginning of my education as a gardener. What was I going to do to solve this problem? I'd done a little bit of gardening in other places I'd lived, and always it seemed like if there was some organic matter around that I could collect and put it in or on the soil, I'd never really seen negative effects. Sometimes effects were neutral, a lot of times they were positive. And so here I had, right in front of me, this grand experiment of the garden and the soil and seeing if it was could I bring it back to life? So what do? When you got to haul a lot of stuff, you get the barrow, you put flames on it. Flames, because the barrow has got to go fast. Fast, fast, fast. Now, at the same time, I think if I had to do this over again and knowing what I know now, I really should have painted my wheelbarrow with microbes, because that turns out to be what the real engine of a healthy garden, a healthy farm, and a healthy gut. All right, so what was I putting in my wheelbarrow? Well, you know what? There's a surprising amount of organic matter laying around that is free or cheap. It is unbelievable to me, just sort of the gold mine. And this is, in urban areas, in rural areas alike. And so these are just a few of the kinds of organic matter that I was rounding up, within probably 3, 4, maybe 10 blocks from the house. And you can read all about what those separate piles are down at the bottom of the slide, but sometimes people ask me about pile C, which is Zudu. And so here in Seattle, there's herbivores, big herbivores at our zoo, elephants, all kinds of other ungulates. And so they've got a lot of manure. And the zoo started a program quite a while ago where they gather up all that manure and they compost it. They call it Zoo Do, and you put your name in for a lottery. And if your name is selected, you get to go to the zoo and pick up a lot of Zoo Do. So that was even a part of my organic matter crusades. All right, so these are the kinds of materials that I was collecting. What was I doing with them? Well, I thought that I might be digging all of this stuff into the soil, but the fact is, I didn't have enough time. Anyone who farms and gardens, you always know, you quickly learn, if you don't know already, that time is your most valuable thing. You have to begin to figure out how to prioritize what you're going to do with that time. And I realized, like, oh my gosh, am I nuts? I can't go around digging up the soil, right? Dave just went over what some of the problems are with excessive digging and disruption in the soil. So I turn all this stuff into mulches. Wood chips are among my favorite substrates. They really can help with the fungal populations involved in decomposition. Wood is a really good substrate for them. This particular mulch mix comes at the spring growing season, and there's a lot of fresh green stuff that you can get out of a garden, even on a farm. And the thing about living, recently, I guess I would call it somewhere between living and recently pruned or clipped things, is you see all this green in there. There's still a lot of nitrogen in those kinds of plant tissues. And so I want to capture all that nitrogen as a part of my mulch and let it do a slow drip back into the soil so that it can feed the plants. So hinoki, that's just a type of evergreen. There's some evergreen clippings in there, and then some maple leaves. I got some dogwood. I got some perodia. Pretty much, it's kind of like when you go to the refrigerator and you ask yourself, what am I going to have for dinner? And you just start pulling stuff out and you find a combination. And every time it's a little bit different. But the real key that I figured out with my mulch mixes, my refrigerator was both living and dead plant matter. And the key, however, was to make sure to try and include a lot of different things in my mulches. So a lot of people might say, oh, that's really unscientific. Oh, okay. Well, I'll tell you what, I never had any negative effects of my mulch mixes. And you have to sort of come up a level sometimes from why you're doing things. And the key here is if I continued to put out the same mulch, week after week or season after season, and if it was a monoculture mulch, I know I like wood chips, but if a mulch is only wood chips, you're only feeding part of the soil microbiome. All right. So that's in part why diversity is key here. You've got, as you all know at Compost Academy, there are a lot of different microbial species in the soil. And to the extent that you as a farmer gardener can provide, a diversity of forms of organic matter, you're feeding a far wider variety of organisms in the soil. And as I'll get into what all those organisms can do, right? We want to support them. So there's that crappy old soil there at the bottom of the slide. And then interesting, this isn't even, after a decade, this is just after several years. You can see the amount of organic matter that I've been able to build through the addition of mulches. And up at the top of the slide, of course, that's one of my mulches, and it's a more broken down form. So I was pretty thrilled with this. My plants were really thrilled with this. And this was a soil that we eventually got after about maybe, I think it was about 11 or 12 years, that nice dark soil on the right side there. And then there was a small area behind the garage where we never did anything to the soil because I don't want anything to grow behind the garage. And that's kind of what we had started with. So you can see it is possible in a relatively short time to really transform soil. All right, so if all this is happening, in the soil, beneath our feet, all that mulch, what's happening on top? Well, this is that dead old stretch of side yard that I'd started with. We had comfort, we had beauty, we had solace, we had privacy. It was just amazing, in short. And not one lick of NP or K grew all of these plants. There was not one lick of any sort of biocide, insecticide, pesticide, herbicide, none of that. You let plants rocket and you provide them with what they need, which is a healthy microbiome, and this is what can happen. And food. You heard Brian talk a little bit about how they're getting their food system back up on its feet. And this is also was a big part. We had not a huge area for growing food, but I really, really like fresh greens in particular. And so that's what I focused on here. All right. So, I was wheeling the barrow. I was hauling stuff around. I was laying out the mulch. And that was a lot of work for sure. But I had trillions and trillions of friends, ranging from, we've all seen these earthworms in the soil. And I just like this shot because it's just so intimate in terms of this worm is taking in leaf fragments. It's covered in the stuff. So in goes organic matter, runs through the gut of the earthworm. Out the other end comes some of the finest compost you will ever find, that of a worm. So these are the big forms of soil life. There's a lot of smaller organisms that you begin to need to see, view through a microscope, and then all the way down to the teeny tiny microbes. And so there on the left-hand side, that's a clump of bacteria. And on the right-hand side, what that is that large, the largest thing in that slide is a root hair, which even in and of itself is quite tiny. And those spherical objects, those are fungal spores, mycorrhizal fungal spores, if I had to guess at that. And they are coating and swathing that root hair. So I'll get into a little bit more about the implications of all of that as we go along here. All right, because I know that this crowd cares about something, I think this is the best factoid out there. Microbial necromass, my friends. We're talking dead microbes, okay? That's what that means. And this is what these folks did, is they measured the amount of dead microbes in soils, and lo and behold, look at what they found. That it was the microbial component of the soil organic matter that was contributing about 33% of the organic matter in forest soils, about 62% in grasslands. This is wild, okay? So what this means is the more you grow microbes, they live for a while, then they die, then they become soil organic matter. So if we can boost our microbial populations, they provide, of course, many benefits while they're living, but look at what they do in death. This is incredible. And it's something I think that we should all be aware of and pay more attention to, because they're giving throughout the life cycle, right? Life to death, and on it goes. And on that note, I want to sort of devote the remaining slides here to microbiomes. And so microbiomes are really communities and populations of bacteria, fungi, archaea, viruses, protists, all the stuff that in general is too small to see with the naked eye. Most are single-celled, not quite all. And there's so much to say about microbiomes, but I have sort of 3 key points to share. And the first is they are supposed to be in their hosts. And so a host is a plant, an animal, a person. It could be your dog, your cat, your goldfish, all of our wild plants, all of our wild animals on land and in marine environments. They all have their own microbiome, and it is supposed to be there, all of these communities and populations. And what is just sort of foundational about these microbiomes, regardless of host, is both directly and indirectly, and in a number of different ways, they make the nutrients in a host diet actually available to that host. So there's a lot of stuff going on, especially in animals, any living organism in the animal kingdom with a gut. A lot of the microbiome function happens in the gut. And I'll be talking more about microbiomes in plants because they don't really have a gut, right? But the same thing applies to plants. Their microbiome, it's really about making nutrients accessible and available to their host. And when you have a relationship as tightly coupled as that between microbiome and host, there are profound effects on the host cells and genes, depending on how functional their microbiome is. Is everybody there who needs to be there? Is everybody in rough ratio and proportion to what they need to be? Is that microbiome getting supported? All right, so when it comes to plants, the lion's share of the plant microbiome is not above ground at all, although there are microbes, of course, living on leaves, fruit, and things like that. But most of the plant microbiome is below ground, where it associates with, specifically, with the plant's root system. Now, I imagine most of you at Compost Academy probably know this, but I just think it's worth sometimes standing back and going, are you kidding me? The root system? What is happening down in the soil that makes most of the plant microbiome want to be there, right? There's got to be something really great down there. Indeed, there is. Exudates. Exudates are liquids that plants manufacture because plants have this ability to photosynthesize, and they have a lock on sunshine. I'm not able to photosynthesize, neither are you. Plants are the only organisms that can do this, and they take their photosynthetic ability and all of the energy they get from that, and they direct about 30 to 40% of their energy to exudate production. Okay, so this is significant. Would you take 30 to 40% of your paycheck and go put it out on the sidewalk and walk away from it? I doubt it. I mean, maybe if you're a billionaire, but it seems like those kinds of folks don't really do that. Nonetheless, plants, they're not just giving these exudates away. They are recruiting their microbiome to the root system. They're recruiting, sustaining, and maintaining that microbiome with these exudates. And so really, these exudates and the root system are like a primo restaurant for all of these microbiota. They can't get up out of the soil and go walk away and get something else to eat. It's exudates or it's exudates, right? That's what there is. So these are just there's been a lot of research and study on two common microbes that make up the crop microbiome, bacteria and fungi. So what's happening is these plants are releasing all of these exudates, and there are tens of thousands of different kinds of exudates. And they release those. Fungi get a hold of these exudates, it nourishes them, and I call them the fetching fungi because they go way beyond the root system of a plant, and out at the tips of their fungal hyphae, they're obtaining nutrients for their plant host. A lot of times this is minerals. This is stuff like iron, like zinc. That's essential for plants to have. Interestingly, these mycorrhizal fungi, these are the fetchers, out in the far distant tips of their body, they have their own microbiome, and it happens to be bacterial. It's dominated by bacteria, many of which are producing enzymes that are making these minerals in the soil available to the fungi. So it's just these symbioses that are nested in one another. And without the fetchers having their microbiome up and running, they're not able to get the micronutrients for their plant host. For those bacteria that are sticking closer to the root tip, they're making all kinds of compounds with the exudates that they consume. In many cases, there's a lot of signaling compounds in which the bacteria are letting their plant host know about things like moisture levels, whether or not pathogens are approaching, all kinds of intelligence and information about that local environment, as well as, get this, growth hormones. So here the botanical world has farmed out something really important, growth hormones, to bacteria that are part of their microbiome, and the bacteria make these growth hormones, provide them back to the host in exchange for exudates. Pretty wild. And here's just an image of some of these fetching fungi out far distant from the root. Those arrows point to the fungal hyphae. These are the parts of the fungal body that transport things back and forth between plants themselves, between, say, these bacteria out at the tips of these fungi are obtaining micronutrients. They get into these hyphae and they get shipped back to the plant. All right. I mean, this raises a lot of questions, right? So one of them, chief in my mind, is what can a microbiome do on a diet of exudates? And when I say a diet of exudates, I mean a robust, year-round, excellent diet of exudates. Well, let's take a look at that, because it turns out quite a bit. So take the top row there where you see the pepper plant. That root, one of their root exudates is malic acid, and it happens to influence that symbiont, that's Bacillus subtilis GBO3. That's just a bacterium. And interestingly, when you increase populations of the bacillus, that bacterium, boom, look what you get. You get a decrease in aphids and this scoundrel, Ralstonia solanacearum. Ralstonia is the pathogen that when you go out, your plant looks fine one day, you go out the next, and the thing is completely wilted and dead. All right. Ralstonia is a big, big problem in many areas for many crops. So you have a well-fed microbiome, especially if you're able to boost populations of bacillus, and this is what it can do, decrease pathogen pressure. Let's take a look down here at melon and watermelon. Again, that root exudate listed there, cucurbitacins. All right, you get more Enterobacter, more bacillus. I like this. Look at that outcome. An increased resistance to fungal pathogens. So here's a question. Do we need more pesticides in the soil, or do we need more robust microbiomes? We need more robust microbiomes. If you didn't know that, that would be my answer. That is the answer. Okay. So in essence, what we have here is one of the grandest symbioses that we know about in the history of life, which goes back some 3.5, 4 billion years ago. That's generally the agreement on when we get these early forms of life. You fast forward a bit and you get these microbes that start associating with the earliest land plants, with the root systems. So this is ancient and time tested. I don't know anything. Of course, we've not been around for billions of years, but there's little in the way of human technology that has this kind of track record that ensures these kinds of outcomes. And so we very much want to keep this symbiosis intact and functioning, because this is what can happen. You get this consortium of partners that are covering their own health and the health of their host. So this is why I say, a well-fed crop microbiome, this is really, in essence, a health plan for soil and crops. All right, which leads to another question. What if crop microbiomes were actually nourished because of farming and ranching practices? Now, I'm mostly going to talk about the crop end of things, but there's a whole parallel story for livestock that we unfold in What Your Food Ate. So this is really, this is the microbiome in animal guts and in the soil has huge consequences for the nutrient density of plant and animal foods in the human diet. And what I'll share with you is what one of the sort of the big takeaways that David and I had from doing all of the research for What Your Food Ate is what we call the Fab Four. And oftentimes, if you dip into crop research at all, you'll often see stuff focused on protein levels or carbohydrate levels and things like that. The Fab Four are different. Most of these, the micronutrients up there at the top and the two I have circled there, those mostly do not build the biomass of a plant or animal. And that's interesting because we're in farming, we're kind of obsessed with yield and how big things are, and that's the biomass. What we know about the Fab Four is once you grow the biomass, whether animal, person, or plant, even microbe, that's not the end of life. Really, most of life is taking care of that biomass, making sure the biomass is functioning. Of course, in us, look at all the organ systems here, digestive tract, brain, and so on. All that stuff's got to function and function normally. And that's where the Fab Four really, really are important. And so we want our plant and animal foods with an abundance and diversity of these things. And I'll run you through an example right now. And one other point on the Fab Four. I'm not a plant. I can't photosynthesize and get phytochemicals into my body. I'm not a rock. I can't weather out all of these micronutrients, zinc, iron, and so on. I'm certainly not a microbe, so I can't make these microbial metabolites. That's what I mean. Like, these things are only in the plant and animal foods of the human diet, and we need them for normal function. I'm a little, I don't like how too often people talk about, you need to eat a superfood, you need to have a super body, you need to have super metabolism. Actually, we just need for things to not be abnormal. We need things to be normal, how they're supposed to be, right? So that's the power of the Fab Four. They help us just function normally. And going to run you now through a quick example on phytochemicals in plant foods and actually animal foods too. So here's what's going on. Those phytochemicals and fiber, often phytochemicals and fiber are packaged together in plant foods. They come into our bodies. And as you can see on the left-hand side here, the number of microbes, bacteria in this case, it just increases exponentially as you descend down the human digestive tract. And we don't have the human genome, whether mine or yours, we lack a number of enzymes for thoroughly and fully breaking down whole plant foods in the human diet. So they go through the stomach, our small intestine, and they land in the lower reaches of our digestive tract, which is the colon. And this is where things are absolutely transformative. There they sit, and this is where most of the human microbiome is located. Not in the stomach, not on our skin or anything like that. It's down here in the colon. And this is sort of the easiest way I can think of to sort of impress upon you. This is our rhizosphere, right? So this is the equivalent of the plant root system and all that is happening in that area to support the health of the host. And so here's what happens. Dietary phytochemicals and fiber comes into us, and you may be wondering, why does she have the cow on there up in the left-hand corner? Well, here's why. Because ruminants, so this is cows, goats, and sheep, they too have a rhizosphere. It happens to be actually at the very upper end of their digestive tract. And a lot of these phytochemicals will transfer through into their tissue. So if you get a really orangey yellow colored butter, that's because the beta carotene the animal has consumed through a diet of fresh forages is making it all the way through into dairy products. And part of that is helped with what the ruminant microbiome does. But in our case, those phytochemicals and fiber and whole plant foods, we take them in, they go down the hatch, they meet our microbiome down there in the colon, and boom, we've got another case of microbial metabolites that happen to have all of these outcomes and effects. Anti-cancer, I love that. Anti-diabetic, great, let's control blood sugar. Anti-inflammatory, yes, yes, brain health, heart health. These are all of the things that we need, all right? And so in many ways, in the human colon, depending that is on what you're eating, you have an onboard pharmacy. All of these different sort of chemical groups, if there's any chemists out there, you can see there's, and even if you're not, you can see that there's quite a few different kinds of chemicals here. All right. The third one up from the bottom there, the pink, it says SCFA-small lipids. Those are called SCAFAs. And these SCAFAs are a really in-depth research area with the microbiome, because they're these small little molecules and they turn out to do all kinds of things inside the human body, beneficial things. And the upshot here is that about 40% of the compounds circulating in my body and in your body at any one time, they weren't made by a human cell. They were made by a microbial cell. All right, so just kind of sit with that for a minute, right? This is why we want to support the human microbiome, and the best way to do that is through a diet. And a diet, it needn't be exclusively plant foods, because there's a lot of things that are really good about animal foods, but it is to say, make sure you're providing, a diet rich in phytochemicals and fiber, because that's what the human microbiome thrives on. And this, indeed, you knew this was coming. This is part of our health plan. It always has been, right? Long before we had pharmaceuticals and drugs, what we had was our microbiome and the human diet. And people say, well, really, does that matter that much? Yeah. Up until maybe 100, depending on where you live, 100 years ago or so, this is all we had. And you look at the number of human beings spread across the planet, and that tells me that the human microbiome put together with the human diet is foundational to our health. All right, Dave and I have thrown a lot of things at you here, and we're going to move into Q&A, but really, this is your upshot. If it's good for the land, it's good for us too. And as far as the books go, they're available pretty much anywhere you want to buy a book, and they are also all available for, some people listen to their books, so they're also available on audiobooks. All right, I think that's it. We are ready to roll on Q&A. And of course, the Regen is coming, new book. And that's available, right, Dave, for pre-order right now?
Yes, it's pre-orderable now. It'll be released sometime this summer. And it's a synthesis of the others, and the chart is more forward-looking.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going
Can't wait to read it.
Yes, I'm going to stop the screen share so we can see each other. There we are.
Oh, that was lovely. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Anne. That was fantastic. Well, we've got an exciting thing coming up. We have a big giveaway we're going to announce. But first, we're going to share about Compost Academy. So we got talking a little bit of Compost Academy. It's an awesome program coming up. We're going to do a book giveaway, and then we'll get to the really juicy Q&A. So we have, in just 2 weeks, a really fantastic opportunity for folks who want to learn how to restore their soils. At Compost Academy, we're starting a 13-week program that's going to walk you through the entire process of how to create amazing biologically rich compost and restore it. So it's the beginning of a journey. You're going to be taught by Brian Keish and Casey in a little bit. Brian Keish, Casey are professionals who do this. We're going to move beyond theory to teach you in practice how you do this as a professional composter, a professional soil consultant. How do you actually get these things started? So if you're a composter, whether you're large scale, small scale, doing a thermophilic pile in your backyard or trying to do this on a big lot, we want to really show you guys how to create effective and high value soil amendments at the scale you need and move beyond theory to actually learn the methods to do it. So you're not stuck in your head, but you're actually learning with your hands. For soil consultants, for people who want to do this as professional, we want to help you guys gain the real world experience in biological composting that applies to you as a professional. And so you can actually get practical training during this program and apply practices that will help you with real world applications for clients. For farmers, growers, and land managements, we want to help you create systems for composting so that you can actually cut your inputs and get yields without having to resort to chemicals. Cut the addictions out of your out of your land's life cycle, and also turn your waste inputs. Turn mountains of, whether it's mountains of wood chips, mountains of green waste, mountains of food, and actually turn it into these biological amendments to help your entire cycle. For landscapers, we want to help you actually add really amazing services to your business, whether that's organic land and tree care, whether it's making extracts or teas. We want to show you how to integrate really high valuable biological compost into the services that you already do for your clients. And of course, cut the toxic chemicals that you don't want to use in your business. And so we've got examples all over, and some of these great examples from Southern California. Linda's on this webinar right now. Amazing things she's created at the woodshed, and Keisha and Casey helped her transform her landscape from, after the Malibu fire. We've got a really fantastic story on this, from what used to be ash, and very quickly, in just a few years' time, back into an oasis. It moves the succession from what can be a catastrophe back into a productive system. And we're going to release the video next week. I promise you guys. Ramirez Canyon, where they turned, and again, another post-fire landscape, into this beautiful, productive native ecosystem. And we're showing everyone how they can create the same biological systems to do that in the land where they are. So we've got students from all around the world, mostly from North and South America, who are really gunning for it, really producing amazing compost, and actually seeing the results in their land, in the biology, under the microscope. And they're starting a really fantastic journey. Megan's here. She's an amazing living soils consultant. She's helping growers and land managers with their own soil fertility. She's teaching her own workshops all across the states. Well, she got one really big one planned, and she's working with clients restoring biology on their landscapes. It's great having her. We have Johnny joining us next week for a big webinar. He is a student, great urban organizer of the Soul Sponge Collective. He worked with Keisha and Casey to help regenerate urban landscapes across the Hollywood Hills, and they started a composting lot on an organic orange orchard down in Southern California. So he took the leap because he saw the value of what compost could do on this landscape. And then we have Chad Dutai. He's starting to make inoculum grade compost all the way up there in Nova Scotia, Canada. He joined the Compost Academy to improve his processes so that he could create the kind of compost that can restore landscapes, the kind of compost that Keisha and Casey create with Catalyst Bioamendments. Jody Wright, she's a wine grower, and her livelihood depends on the health of her soil and on the health of her grapes. She joined Compost Academy because she said to us, I have no option. I have to make this work. And so by using biological amendments, creating our compost, she's seeing the reduction in the inputs she needs to grow better grapes and have a more profitable business. So we have all these examples from people all across so many different contexts, across North and South America, who are making this work, mostly North America though. And so what we're going to teach you, we're going to teach you a wide range of composting techniques, thermophilic composting, static, a little bit about vermicomposting. We're going to teach you biological extracts and teas, brewing, scaling applications, and replacing the expensive and toxic chemical inputs with biology. We're going to have an extended range of case studies from everywhere, from farms, landscapers, growers, and of course, composters. And I'm going to show you how to compost on a wide range of different scales. And of course, how to locate the right input materials and create amazing recipes for doing so. So what's in there? It's 13 weeks of live group training. There's a self-paced program you get access to, The most important thing in online and in-person community, you're going to be joining so many people who are doing this alongside you. And there's going to be lots of bonus sessions from everything ranging from nematodes, compost extracts, even microscopy. So that's going to be fun. So all in all this together, there's a special webinar deal that I'm posting in the chat right now. If you join by Monday, you get $100 off. It's only $18.50. And the really big value of this, you get access to the next live training program for free. So you basically get access to 2 programs for one. You get access to the self-paced training program. You get access to bonus microscopy trainings and coaching programs that we just kind of announce out of the blue. And you get discounts to any live and self-paced programs we have going on, like the microscopy program. And of course, you get discounts to future workshops. So we really want you guys to jump in. It starts April 9th. We only do this twice a year. And so we want you to dive in and get the best results you can through the summer. So join that there. It's Compost Academy. And in the chat, you've got the link there. It's available till Monday. Give you $100 off. And now time for the giveaway. Going through this, so I've decided by all of the wonderful questions we've had in, I've decided to give the giveaway to the most engaged person so far, and that's Teresa Lavella. You did, Teresa. You won the book giveaway. You get dirt. You get Hidden Half of Nature. And of course, you get What Your Food Ate. I'll reach out to you after this in an email to see if you want to get it, do hard paperbacks or audiobooks. So congratulations, Teresa. You did it. So now we're going to get to some really fun Q&A here. Let me stop that share. So let's get started with what you guys want to hear. So let's start with Teresa. You won the book giveaway. You get first dibs on your question. I see that in the Q&A. Teresa's saying, have you done a chemistry analysis on either of those soils? I have acreage that chemistry analysis says I need tons of calcium, nitrogen, potassium. I do not have animals on the soil, but I'm considering new management strategies. And she's in Washington State.
We have not done full chemical analyses on our soils. We've mostly focused on soil organic matter, but that's in part because we were not looking to try and dial in any other kinds of additional fertilizers.
Cool. And yeah, I guess follow up from Teresa, like, yeah, how did you deal with lots of excessive rain in your garden?
Oh,
How do we deal with excessive rain in our lives up here?
well, you know, this is where mulch absolutely shines because, you know, you put 4-ish inches of mulch all over a garden bed. And you before Raleigh, you talked about somebody with soil, caught my eye, soil sponge. And this is what mulch is. By the end of a summer, it's pretty dried out. I'd say thoroughly dried out. And the way that we get rain in the Pacific Northwest, this is changing a little bit, but we get a nice steady drip and drizzle, or at least we used to, for about, I don't know, 9 months of the year. And when it comes as a drip and a drizzle, it hits the mulch and it slowly over time begins to saturate all that mulch. And we never had any runoff problems. We're getting a little bit different intensity of rain these days, but still, everywhere that I see mulch, I don't see any water running off of anywhere, least of all water that's carrying, you know, that's brown colored because it's eroding soil. So I think it's especially important if you do live in a place that has either a lot of rain or say in the Midwest where you've got short bouts of really, really intense rain. You keep the soil covered and you let the mulch take the beating. You don't ever put soil out there as sort of the first thing that rain hits. It's not made for that, and it doesn't do well under those conditions.
The other key thing about maintaining a soil sponge is that you know, life will poke holes in soil if it has opportunities to do that, and that creates a soil sponge. I just had a paper literally come out in the journal Science a couple last week, I think it was, with an experiment in England where we were looking at documenting how tillage, disturbing the soil, breaks up all the little pathways and connectivity within the soil. And so that it's, often when one sort of like digs or disturbs or tills the soil, you're thinking you're breaking it up to it'll help water get into it and not run off. And often, if not always, tends to have the opposite effect. And that I was shocked that no one had really sort of done the scientific study about how that actually works. But if anybody subscribes to Science, I think it was in last week's issue that came out. And so mulch and compost are really good for that. But you also don't want to be disturbing and digging the soil because you're basically messing up the hydrologic connections that allows that mulch to kind of retain moisture in places where plant roots can use it. And if you have runoff over the surface, particularly a bare soil, it's going to take the soil, it's going to take seeds, it's going to take your fertilizer. It's not good.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, if you've got a larger area and you're thinking, oh, how am I ever going to get mulch out on all of this? Okay, so what we're really after, kind of a higher order thing, is keeping that soil covered. So this is where either cover crops or some other kind of plant come into play. And obviously, if you've got a cash crop of some sort, for the time that's in the ground, that's serving that purpose. But if you have other areas that are not cash crop, get other plants planted there, right? Now you're going to have to be smart about this, right? You're not planting kudzu, okay, or bamboo or something like that. You're going to want these, I'll call them nice plants, okay? So what I mean by that is they're not taking over, they're not rude, they're playing well with the other plants that you have, and you kind of like them. So however you want to cover the soil, think about it that way. Some people use, anyway, there's a lot of things you can use to cover up the soil. It's preferable to have it be something, or, either alive or organic matter, because at the same time, you're going to feed the soil that is beneath.
Yeah, I agree. I think like living mulch is the best mulch on the planet for sure, because it's actively creating soil while you're, like you're saying, is like finding some kind of plant that's your space filler, something that looks nice while it's growing. And then if you want to put something else there, you can just dig it out and then put something else in. But yeah, no, that was funny you brought that up, David, about just like, don't dig in the soil, don't till up that soil. We were just recently planting some plants out in our garden out here, and it was like, put the shovel in, dug it up, and the whole mass was just covered in mycelium, and it was just like, I feel bad, like I feel bad putting a plant into the environment because I'm like ripping apart all this nice healthy fungi that's growing right there in my soil. But it's like, I mean, keep it narrow, but it's just a funny thing.
Yeah. Casey, that reminds me, right? That phrase, moderation in everything. Yeah.
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 And that's the state of agriculture today too, is so anti that, or so different from the idea of keeping covered soils. I mean, we have a lot of clients that come from that conventional world, and bare soil after tillage, and actually bare soil in a lot of orchards is the standard de facto. I mean, I just drove from Northern California all the way back up to Oregon, and everybody's into tilling their fields right now, and they're spraying all their sterilants or their herbicides. And you go through miles and miles and miles and miles of bare soil, and it's just, it's heartbreaking, actually.
It is. It sort of violates the first rule of rebuilding soil.
Completely. Completely.
It's such a bummer seeing that in the Willamette Valley, like right next to it. Like, no, not the Willamette Valley.
Yeah, I mean, if there's ever a place that ought to be able to practice sustainable farming, it's the Willamette Valley.
That's right.
Plenty of moisture. Good solar exposure.
Got all the right ingredients and they ruined. Well, here's a good question from Megan. Thanks for dropping on, Megan. And Megan, if you raise your hand, we can also have you answer this question live. So feel free to do that. But Megan's asking, through any of your research, have you found any evidence that high amounts of soil organic matter cause issues? A lot of folks more accustomed to typical ag have fears it will cause mineral toxicity.
Mineral toxicity. Okay. Huh.
The short answer is no. I have not. Does that preclude the possibility in some environments with some crops and some soils? No. I mean, there's one of the most interesting things about soils is how diverse they are. There's patches of ground in California, for example, on the serpentinite soils, where there's natural mineral toxicity that totally changes the vegetation community. And I've flown over parts of the Amazon where you can literally do mineral exploration by mapping the vegetation communities because of the effect of the weird minerals in some of the really old terrain on what's able to grow there. But, I have yet to see many farms that have, even using regenerative practices, gotten their soil organic matter up above, say, 10%. That's screamingly high. Like the Kaiser's farm, I think it was 10 to 12%. And that's about as high as I've seen or tested on a farm. And there was a paper in, I think it was Nature a few years ago, where people looked at sort of the global state of agricultural soils around the world. And they were like on the order of 1 or 2% organic matter on average for many soils. And they were able to document that there are increases in yields up to at least 4%, if not higher, on everywhere they looked, basically. And when you look at sort of natural soils that might be considered to be relatively infertile, weird things like wetland soils, they only have about 20% organic matter. And they can get kind of acidic and kind of weird in terms of their chemistry because they're reductive environments and so on. But I think it's pretty hard to actually get soil organic matter concentrations high enough to cause really big problems.
Yeah, I would say.
But there's always special circumstances.
Yeah, and also, for growers out there, you've got somebody in your community that's they've got some kind of byproduct of, say, what their business is, and they've got a lot of it, and it happens to be organic. And let's say, let's say it's somebody with in the timber forestry end of things, and all they've got is cedar, and all they've got is tons and tons of finely ground red cedar. And they say, don't you want this organic matter? And you may say, sure, yeah, sounds good. And then what shows up is 10 yards of this stuff. And so I'm kind of making up this story because a lot of one kind of organic matter from one part of the plant is not a good idea, right? It's just, it would be like a person eating, nothing but kale for 1 month, right? That's just not healthy. That's not diverse for the microbiome. It's a big overload. So if you got somebody in your community who's like, hey man, I got all this organic matter for you, and why don't I drop it off, and that'll be a really big favor that I'll be doing you. So always think about moderation and diversity, because that's kind of how nature works with things. There's never any big dump of a single kind of organic matter. And yeah, I mean, what's interesting about the soil microbiome, at least the part that is the saprophytic part, by that I mean all of the decayers and the decomposers, they're ready. If you feed them a diet of a lot of different things, they will break that down. If you overload them with, red cedar, finely ground up sawdust, there's going to be some choking and complaining going on. So don't do that.
I like that you brought that up. I was actually, Megan, when I saw your question come through, I was expecting that you would ask that one. I remember you talking about it in school, and I suspect that data probably comes from the reality that we have so much waste, like the waste reduction compost industry. It's like Anne's talking about, they take all of their organic material. A lot of time it's not diverse or it's toxic. They grind it up super fine. Their composting processes aren't always the best. And I think we're getting to this point, like Brian's always talking about this subscriptive way of looking at our prescriptive way of how we look at our soils. And, we see that, oh, okay, so we have this loss of organic material. David's talking about it. It's measurable, it's vast. And of course, like the first thing I'm sure that the human mind comes up with is, oh my goodness, we have so much compost. All of our trash is getting turned into this biomass that needs to go somewhere. And I suspect that there was probably a time or multiple times that they took a large amount of that material, blended it into their soil and said, whew, I didn't have a good measure of success with this. And I mean, what we know is like, we know this, that you can't take soil that's dead and compacted and light in color and just blend it with reduced waste and bam, everything's there. It's just not going to happen. If you do it the right way, you do it slowly, nature drops its leaves to the ground, different organic materials blow in, like diversity is always there. So if we want to move fast with soil, we have to pay attention to the microbes, right? Like that's really it. And yeah, I can't agree with you more. And like just the chopping finely of one single material, the sawdust mixed with manure is like that's the compost recipe that we've landed on somehow. And it's like we're missing the mark on microbial ecosystems when we're talking about, single source inputs.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would
Right.
love to see if folks have if you want to ask a live question, don't be shy, raise your hand. So we got a lot of type questions, but it'd be really fun to hear some voices. So you have in the bottom, you have that chat function where there's a raise your hand, and we can get to some. Yeah, regarding that, Keisha, yeah, we got to tell the story of that one day, how you guys dealt with, eucalyptus as your guys' main input down in Southern California, like one of the most challenging materials you could ever imagine. And yet you guys did it. You managed to compost it. That was
Yeah,
pretty cool.
we did. I mean, just shortly, we did bring in some other chips. We had a superstar on the team, and she was like, and you'd love her. She's an organic material getter. Like we got down there and it was like we had, I don't know, like 1,000 yards of wood chips that were single source eucalyptus. And we were like, oh no. And she got on the phone and just started calling landscape company after landscape company. And every day we were just like praying for drops. Like, come on. If we get oaks, we're all cheering. Yeah, we got a lot of oak. But just a teeny bit of diversity, actually, and some really focused watering and microbial applications. We were able to turn it into something that I would call a microbe mulch, which I love this too, Anne, that you're a mulch specialist. You put everything on top of the ground. For years, I've been thinking, why don't we just make a bio-focused mulch? Like that would be such an
Yeah.
awesome product, right? It's just heavy. That's the only thing that's bad about it, is it's moist.
Yeah. 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 And it takes some labor to get it out, but it's also, I kind of consider mulch like in the kitchen, we talk about a pantry staple, right? That
Mhm.
might be depending on your diet, that might be beans or cans of tomatoes or whatever. But I really think mulch is a farm and garden staple. You want it on hand all the time because you're going to grab it because you need it right now. And so that calls for some planning and some management of getting the materials, ready to make the mulch. So, and once you start thinking of things in terms of a staple, then you can better stay on top of quality
Mhm.
of it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
makes
and you hit on something too that I think is really important is when you're thinking about designing your yard or designing your growing operation, really allocating space to be able to hold those materials. Because a lot of these materials that you get, like in mulch in particular, having them age for a little bit of time
Yeah.
sometimes is just magical as far as the ability for them to be able to be ready to decompose quickly and not have those antimicrobial compounds that will volatilize into the soil if you actually use it too early.
And that the time over which compost can say we say mature, or the fungal communities in particular that can mature, that also helps to degrade any pathogens or inherited pharmaceuticals or whatever might be in one's compost. When we were writing What's Your Food Date, we ran into some people who had done some long-term, some year-long studies of sort of the evolution of the microbial composition of compost, and it was amazing
Mm.
how the microbial community at the end was completely different than at the start, which was reassuring in the sense that, if any of the pathogens in particular had been inherited from however one got that compost, if they get consumed several times over through different microbes, it kind of solves that problem.
Right. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
actually reminds me, I'm trying to remember what the scientist's name was on this, but they had these vats in this basement of some university, and they were watching these microbial populations in them. They were doing some study, and then they left them and forgot about them. and they sat there for like, I don't know, it was like 10 years or something like that. And they went back and they checked it again and it was completely different, right? And then they got this idea. They're like, whoa, what's happening here? Like different species almost are in there, and they're like weird. So they kept just checking it every periodically, and it was just like this cascade of like one species would rise and then
Yeah,
collapse, and then a different species would rise and collapse, and it was just like this symphony of microbes, just like
right,
ever changing,
right. Yeah,
Same thing in
yeah,
your wood chip pile, right? Or your
yeah,
finished compost pile. It's like they're kind of the pioneer species, I guess, if you want to call them that, or starting that
yeah,
breakdown. But then you get those later growth ones that, yeah, and the community completely changes.
Yeah.
yeah. And this is in part why some are not maybe particularly enamored with the power of organic matter, because you try and standardize it and you try and say, here's your application rate and blah, blah, blah. And you can't do that with compost because, and you shouldn't be able to anyway, as David said, there's not the same soil anywhere on this planet. And I mean the same identical soil. So why would you think that you're going to standardize a nutrient source like mulch or organic matter? It all depends. And this is where really I think the skill and the thinking of a good farmer or gardener comes into things, because they know their soil. And somebody had asked the question about uh, too much organic or chemical analysis. And that's where, if you were to do a chemical analysis on your soil and you see, and I'm making this up, it's low in sulfur. I sort of always ask, well, it depends on what kind of crop you're growing and how sensitive that crop is to either high levels of sulfur or low levels, and what else is sulfur doing with, some of these other plant nutrients. So it's really important to know that. And it also suggests that therefore you also would not standardize compost. If you got some high sulfur component in your already high sulfur soil, that's a no-go, right? You're not trying to increase the sulfur, you're trying to keep it balanced. So and I guess I kind of, in nature, there's not any planning out there for which kind of leaves fall on which kind of leaves, and then you get some fungi in there, and then you have a certain animal coming by with a certain kind of manure. Somehow plants are figuring out, along with their microbiome, what to take from the organic matter that's local. And I do think we underestimate the power of plants and their microbiome to discern, this is what as long as I have a diversity of things and I can go and procure what it is I need, that's all a crop or a plant is asking for. And when we don't provide the choice, so to speak, and all that's sitting there is red cedar sawdust, right? That's going to be, or only fresh eucalyptus, that'll be a problem. Yeah. So I'm all for like using the brain of the plant and the brain of the microbes, so to speak, to work things out, because they've been working things out, microbiomes in their hosts for a long, long time.
I think this. Oh, sorry, Keisha. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
I am. Why would if I was going to try to steal a question, just or
Go
maybe you
for
can
it.
wrap like a few questions into
Steal
one just for my
away.
own self, because I've been waiting for this for a while. But I want to talk about the human microbiome, and I want to ask you guys, because I really don't know. I've never got to do this sort of diving into the microbes that we take on. But have you found in your studies like that we actually that the soil that we have contact with, the plants that we touch, the air that we breathe, the environments that we walk in and work in and operate in every day, that we take on microbes from outside of us? I know our microbiome comes primarily from our mother and the female lineage through, all of our history. It's ancient. But did you find anything in your studies that like relate to how these microbes might come from outside inside of us?
Yeah. Yeah, you come across that. And what generally is known, it does start out in vaginal births. It starts with mom's microbes first. And those come from her body, from the vaginal and digestive tract. And so those are the first inoculant for the baby. And what's so interesting about that is that the infant microbiome from the get-go is set up for mom's milk. And it's not really the protein and the fat in mom's milk that nourishes the human cells of the infant, but it's the oligosaccharides, of which there are a huge diversity in mammalian breast milk. Those nourish the baby's microbiome. That's in part why breast milk is really important for newborns. But after weaning, right, there's no more oligosaccharides. The biomass of the baby has kind of gotten to the point, and the microbiome has also developed to the point where they're ready for the next phase, and that is foods of the human diet, primarily because a lot of those are coming into the gut. But it is also all of those other sources that you mentioned, Keisha, and there's not a lot known about other than water, air, a person's local environment, this pencil, this thing. Those are sources. How long any of the microbes that I pick up from these things stay in my body and what they're doing, that's far less known. But certainly before they're, back in our foraging and hunting days, and before we were living in large populations in urban and city kind of environments, we'd walk around all day in some kind of an ecosystem, and we'd drink water out of creeks, and we'd walk on soil, and we had our hands all over plants and animals, whether we were smelling these plants or eating them or butchering animals. And so that was a source as well for the human microbiome. And it's hard to say, and even today, like I just ate an apple before the webinar, and I was thinking about, so I recently was listening to some talk, and somebody was talking about the bacteria inside of the apple. So not on the surface, but inside of the apple. And I'm eating the apple, and I'm like, wonder what's in here. I'm not sure, I guess. But so far, and then of course, right, any sort of fermented bread, fruit, or vegetable, those are coated with microbes, and they're coming directly into us. So I'd say it's an under-researched, underappreciated, understudied thing, except of course, this overlaps with the pathogens that are also in air and water and food. And so there it becomes a bit murkier, and not all is hunky-dory. But we've been obtaining microbes and recruiting them into our microbiome for as long as we've been around as a life form, as we're likewise with our ancestors.
I always wonder too that in our day and age, in such a short period of time frame, a lot of food that people eat today is sterile. It does not contain any of the microbes that would have been typically found on any food that we would have eaten through human history. And all of a sudden, it was like with a very short period of time frame. And you just got to figure, how much does that impact the whole microbiome inside of you because of the sterileness of the food, and then toxicity, obviously, with the associated set of chemicals that come along with it that would ruin or hurt your microbiome. Yeah. I make it a practice every time I go out there when I'm harvesting my carrots. I'll harvest a carrot and I'll just kind of brush it off and then eat the carrot.
Yeah. I would love to see a study, of call it whatever plant food you want to pick, a grain, a fruit, a vegetable grown under regenerative practices. Do an analysis of the microbiome on the external and internal to that food. Get that same crop on a adjacent farm, kind of like the study that we did. Find out what is on and in those things, and do a comparison and say, have any of these microorganisms from this food, are they in the human microbiome among, most of whatever population you're studying, or are they not? And to just kind of start asking some questions like that. There's a paper, I heard a short story yesterday on the radio about a recent paper in Nature Microbiology that was talking about how it looks like perhaps that soils that are under drought stress, that are becoming drier and drier, they're finding more antibiotic resistance genes in those soils. And so antibiotics are produced naturally by soil bacteria. They always have been. It's their, swords and daggers and bombs. They don't generally deploy them at levels that we do. It's more like a warning, like, don't come any closer because I got more of this toxin and I will put it out there in the soil if you come any closer. But then some bacteria gain resistance to these antibacterial toxins that other bacteria are putting out. And it's appearing that drought soils. So I'm thinking of, there's some places like Colorado is under a drought, probably a drought thing this summer. And there's something that's happening with bacteria where the droughty conditions are causing the expression of these resistance genes. Same study looked at levels of resistance genes in, I believe, patients in the hospital in these drought-stricken areas, and they're finding more antibiotic resistance genes in these patients in local health places as well. It's correlation. There's still, a lot more to learn about this, but I thought that was interesting. Goes kind of back to your question, Keisha, of where are we getting our microbes from? And if in these drought places, they're getting stirred up in air, they're getting into water, they're getting on food, and then we're consuming them, are we bringing more antibiotic resistant genes into our bodies? I don't know. I don't know.
So much more to learn, so much more science that we've got to be able to get.
And likewise, what about people living around farms where soil is not droughty, where food is regeneratively grown? Is this again sort of an underappreciated aspect of the microbiome health plan?
Yeah, and then studying the reality of like the microbe. Look, we just talked about how much it changes and how many variables there are, and then you try to tie them together with a cohesive study. And I'm sure it's there's a lot of problems with just that, trying to figure out causation versus correlation and all that. We've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, there's a comment in here in the chat, and just a comment, and it reminds me that really what we ought to be aiming for, there was a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge behind traditional / indigenous practices, whether that's in agriculture or medicine or diets. And we tend to polarize and either say, oh, we all got to do that. Or on the other end, oh, we all need to be eating these like super technology foods that have had, I don't know, various things put in them. And I really think we ought to take what we know, what has worked in the past, which is many of these indigenous practices, processes, products, and so on, and combine that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with modern science or modern technology. It's all in how we deploy it. And if we were to, say, put indigenous or traditional practices forward and say, what if that was the North Star and we developed technology around that, around making sure that can still function, maybe boosting it, improving it, protecting it? What would that look like? Instead of technology usually comes along and pounds on the other stuff too hard, and it can't function. Can't function normally.
And they don't have to be diametrically opposed either. Like you said, there is a synergy that could be there. I mean, we develop technologies because we have that special skill. The human brain can critically think through those things, and having that history and that knowledge behind the scenes to be able to take that wisdom that it took how many generations or eons to learn, why we just threw that out. It just seems crazy.
I know. Yeah, some of us are trying to get it out of the gutter and bring it back to the light of day,
No doubt. Such a good call to action. I like it.
Sure. But also, like technology, Keisha and Casey, they're using large turners, but you can use an extract with one of those ginormous spray rigs but have really amazing compost extract with it. Same thing with
That's right.
using excavators to build earthen ponds. It's like technology doesn't have to be evil. It's just like,
Right.
yeah, the context, it's how you use it. Oh, there's so many good questions, folks. Sorry if we don't get to everyone here. I know time
I
is
don't think
limited.
there's
We
a
got
chance.
so many fantastic ones. I'll have to
I
come
saw a
back
bunch
on
of
here.
questions around people being concerned about, I saw 3 or 4 questions around people being concerned of the quality of their input materials and transferring herbicides and other chemicals into their compost or their lawn. And I'm sure you have something to say about this. For us, like we have those concerns for sure, but oftentimes it's so hard when you're making compost to know precisely where it's coming from. So on a very small scale, it's pretty easy to talk to your neighbors and say, how has this organic material been treated? But when we're talking about large scale, often what we need to do is first try it and then, test later and
Yeah.
see, so.
Yeah. Or if you had, some target things that you were really concerned about, to be able to test for levels of those things. It's sort of like, I think it's the Environmental Working Group has I think they call it the Dirty Dozen. It's crops that tend to carry the highest pesticide load, and there's could be something like that, so that well, it passed. If it doesn't pass this, we're not taking it, right? You know, yeah, yeah.
Here's a good. I know Teresa, she's had her hand raised for quite a while. So why don't we do one live question here? Hey, Teresa.
Hey, hello there. Can you
Yeah, we
hear
can
me?
hear
We
you.
can
Okay.
hear you.
All right. And yeah, I'm the other Teresa. I have a permaculture food forest. I'm always putting compost on. We get it from the city of San Luis Obispo biodigester. We get it from Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. But the heavy clay soil doesn't really help the structure. And I always have compacted heavy clay soil no matter all the applications throughout the past dozen years now. You know, guys talk about the miracles that it can do, but not necessarily, it depends. In this case, heavy clay soil doesn't respond to the amounts of compost.
Yeah, Teresa, again, like we're talking about quality of compost. And so the sources that you've mentioned are waste reduction facilities. And so that compost typically is not an ecosystem for all of the organisms that we're talking about that do these good works. So you will find a lot of different bacterial species, archaea in there for sure. But as far as predatory organisms and fungal diversity go, it's not usually present. So it is unfortunate that you're correct. Like not all the time working with composts or mulches are going to get you where you want to go. It's I would suspect that what you would need to do is inoculate that compost that you're getting from the city
Mhm.
with the actual microbes that would be doing the work of transitioning your soil to create that soil structure. So, bacteria is very good at breaking down organic materials. It's very good at literally making them disappear. But fungi is actually what's going to be a huge, huge, huge worker in creating our soil structure down underground. Also, too, when you're talking about the heavy clay soils, we are anti-till almost all the way, but
Mhm.
often when we have someone in your situation, we will say one more till and make sure that you have a really diverse inoculum that's been checked by someone with a microscope or DNA analysis, and getting those microbes down into the soil on that final pass. And then you can imagine now that they're inside of that compacted soil, they can start to do their work with that added organic material that you've put on top. But it
Where do
sounds
you
like
get an inoculum from?
you can make your own. That's the cheapest way. And then you could buy it from someone like Catalyst Bioamendments. We sell small bags of inoculum. That's the mission of our compost business. But yeah, Compost Academy, that's what we actually teach you to do. And we teach you how to do it in many different ways. You could make it with worms. You could use static piles. There's just a lot of little tips and tricks that we're not going to have time. We're ending up
Right. I
the
make my
webinar,
own
but
static piles also,
Great.
and worm castings also. But even radishes won't grow. It's just the soil is too hard.
Yeah.
But that's where, the one time when tillage may actually be a very useful tool is with heavily compacted soils.
Yeah, the broad forking and just other digging forks.
And you might need a little bit more to break up some of those heavy compaction in there, but broad fork's a good start. I mean, it's going to open up some of those pathways and getting plants in the system too.
Yeah,
If you have hard, heavy compacted, you can also look at cover crops, another
I
good
do
way.
that.
Uh,
Yeah,
Great. So it sounds like you're probably there's just a few pieces that you got to put together in the puzzle. It sounds like you got most of it there. It's just
Right.
how do you get that relationship between the microbes, the organic matter, and the plants to
Right, because
really
I still
start
have a lot
aggregating
of
the
I
soil?
still got a lot of aphid pressure
Sure, you
and
will.
stunted plants.
Yeah, the compacted soil, the problem with compacted soil is that it just doesn't open those pathways. They will dry out very, very quickly. It's really hard for roots to be able to penetrate through, and you just don't have the aggregation. But really, the aggregation's all going to come from the biology. It's going to come from the bacteria and fungi creating micro and macro aggregates. And that's what's really going to allow. We've dealt with a lot of heavy clay soils before, and they can be a challenge, no doubt.
yeah.
But you can turn them around. There is plenty of success stories in doing that. It's just getting all the right pieces together to be able to kind of do that unlocking.
Yeah,
If
I even
you
asked Dr. Elaine Ingham when she was in San Luis Obispo here in California. She talked about gypsum, applying gypsum.
Hmm.
It- yeah, un
Well,
poquito.
A little
appreciate
bit.
A little
Teresa.
bit. Yeah.
Appreciate your
Yeah.
questions. We
Yeah,
can go deeper into this subject on further
for
webinars, but
sure.
appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, you're totally welcome. I see one. Molly asked this question multiple times. I like this one. Then we can go one more live one. And oh, Megan, you lowered your hand, but feel free. Yours was the next live one I was going to get to. But this one from Molly was all about urine. She's like, you haven't talked about incorporating urine into your compost. That seems so great. Have you guys ever encountered this or have used this? I've heard about
Collecting
studies
it is
where,
the hard part.
yeah, I've heard about studies in Africa with biochar out of all things. It was like 90%, it was like 10% urine with 90% water mixed with biochar actually worked well in that particular study in that particular context. I'm not sure about a lot of other urine compost-based studies. I know that was a huge issue. I know a lot way back in the day, Elaine dealt with this case study where it's like, yeah, how do you deal with these giant settling pools of cow manure? That's basically liquid manure. Yeah, what do you do with that? That seems like it's a
See,
whole
yeah, that's a whole
deliver
issue.
it to Congress.
yes, great.
There's the solution.
And that's kind of the whole, like, that's the problem. All of that urine and manure should never have been concentrated in that large a
Right.
quantity in the first place. As so it's to the, that's not an answer to the question per se, but I think um, sometimes it's like, I'm not sure that's a fair problem if you can think about problems in that circumstance, like Teresa's problem about the clay soils, like that's something that's normal. I mean, I don't know anything about Teresa's situation, but presuming, that her piece of ground was not a former parking lot for backhoes or something like that, right? She's just dealing with the natural characteristics of that particular soil. And that's where I think doing the kinds of things that have been mentioned would work. Back to the urine question. I mean, urine's free nitrogen, but at the same time, all of us are eating and drinking things that get in. I mean, urine is our excretion, that's the excretion system. That's a waste product. So I don't know what's in all of our urines, all of the
You're in
urine of many people.
the plural.
It's in the urine of many people. Nitrogen for sure. Um, but some say, that's a lot of nitrogen and we ought to be recouping it instead of dumping it into the, wastewater treatment plants and then, out into some water body. I don't know.
You can definitely compost it. We used to live off grid and we'd take whole groups of volunteers. So we'd have 25 people up staying with us for long periods of time. And our only option was to compost the manure and the urine. I will tell you, not to be too graphic, but too much urine in a human manure pile can create horrendous smells. So we had we would use urine diverters so that it would, when a depending on whether you're a man or a woman, when you went to the bathroom, it would get separated away from the solids. And we would just make sure that when we would pour that urine back in, that there was plenty of carbon. And, we let that decompose with human manure, we, let it sit probably for 2 years just because they were static piles. But great stuff for the orchards. I mean, we used it on the mountain and it was absolutely fantastic compost. And it's really interesting when you put a lot of human manure into a pile and let it sit statically, what grows is a garden. Because because when we eat the food, the seeds are, well, nature does its thing, right? So that the seeds come through, and when you put them out the other side, they're totally ready to grow. And so our biggest problem with human manure was getting volunteers not to harvest from the human manure pile, because they would see it and they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, tomatoes!" And we're like, "No, go. That's not a tomato you want to eat." So just remember, if you do decide to start composting your feces and your urine, and you do it in a static way, don't eat that food.
Yeah.
Because it's going to grow.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Wow.
Gonna have the wrong microbiome on it.
Yeah, the wrong microbiome.
Yeah.
I remember seeing organic seed saving farm in New Zealand. She just dumped her manure, like her home manure bucket, straight into her compost pile. She's like, "I trust what I eat. I will grow my vegetables with this and eat those vegetables."
She knew the source.
Damn,
Yeah.
that's pretty hardcore. I wouldn't do that, but
We had volunteers, so we didn't know, they're coming from everywhere. So we're like, let's give it some time.
Yeah, exactly.
Human manure is such a fun topic. I know we could go forever on it.
Well, yeah, if there's no other questions, I think we might be looking to sign off.
Sure.
Yeah,
I think
I
it's
know.
about
We
right
hit
time.
2 hours. We've taken so much of your guys'
We
time.
told you guys, we're famous for this. We'll keep you forever if we can.
Well, it's a great convo. Yeah.
Well, Dave and Anne, we really do appreciate you coming to our webinar. We're all big fans. We have been for a long, long time. And it's just been a great, pleasant 2 hours talking with you and getting to learn more from you guys, which you have always been kind of key to our knowledge source. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having us. And, it kind of comes around because one of the people that we talked to early on in our journey of discovery was Elaine Ingham.
Sure. Yeah. Elaine's so pivotal in all of our...
She was so generous with her time and knowledge.
For sure. No doubt.
Sure.
Yep.
Great. Well, hey, thank you. And we'll see you next time.
Yep.
All right. Take care, David. Take care.
Okay, everybody. Take care.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you for hosting, Raleigh.
Yep.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
All right.
Ciao, everybody.
Ciao.
Bye.